Hello and welcome to the Labyrinth. My name is Pratham Padav, and in this episode, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to be answering some of your questions. The audience members have dropped a few questions in the community tab of YouTube, so I'll be answering a few questions. Let's see. Okay, so the first question that I've received is आज डिनर में क्या है? आज डिनर में पालक और कैरेट की सब्जी है. Let's move on to some important questions. Which conversation did you have here had the maximum impact in your life? Okay, I've had many interesting guests on my podcast, and without a doubt, they've influenced me deeply, and I'm grateful to them. I would like to name 3 guests with whom I've had highly stimulating conversations that has to a certain extent changed the trajectory of my life and my thinking. And those 3 guests are, as some of you might have already guessed, Johan Tengra, Jayant Bhandari, and Tarun Pradhan. Let me talk about Johan. Johan has been on my podcast thrice. The first time I got Johan on the Labyrinth was over a year ago when I just began the podcast. I barely had around 40 subscribers. And I texted him on Instagram and he said yes. I got him because we were in the middle of the second COVID lockdown in India, and he was a huge critic of lockdowns and vaccine mandates. So was I. But other than that, I thought he was crazy initially. I couldn't imagine how anarchy would work or how the world would function without governments. But as I listened to a lot of what Johan has to say, he seems to make sense far more than the so-called experts, the mainstream experts who have been proven wrong numerous times during this pandemic or the so-called pandemic. And in the beginning, many of the things that Johan said sounded very extreme, but as I got to know him better, I've realized that maybe I have to change the way I think. Maybe I am resistant to his ideas because of my conditioning, and Johan has successfully changed the way I think, and he has shaped many of my current opinions. And I've got to know him better as a person, and I've also met him in person when I was in Mumbai this past March. And I've also been very fortunate to meet many of his friends who are wonderful people, and many of his friends have also come on the Labyrinth as guests. So yeah, overall I can say Johan has impacted the way I look at the world, the government, politics, and reality itself. So the next guest that I want to talk about is Jayant Bhandari. Jayant Bhandari has been on the podcast twice. He's arguably the most controversial guest on my podcast. His recent podcast appearance has the highest number of dislikes and negative comments in the history of the Labyrinth. But don't worry, the number of likes are still higher than dislikes, if that even matters. He speaks with a lot of clarity about the failure of Indian society and culture. And as a result, it is bound to offend patriotic Indians who refuse to look at things as they are. I've never been outside of India. I've never even traveled to North India. But I'm at a crucial stage of my life. And self-improvement is of paramount importance to me. You cannot save India from itself, and things have only gotten worse in the past decade. The traffic, the potholes, the corruption, the pollution, the stress, and the infighting of Indians has become unbearable. Fortunately for me, I live in a more peaceful part of India, and I'm relatively well off compared to most Indians, because I would say that I belong to middle class India, which doesn't have a lot of problems compared to the average Indian who belongs to the below poverty line class. And after speaking to Jayant, I'm convinced that I could live a much better life, a high quality life, if I move abroad to a more decent country. Because people are more practical in developed countries as opposed to Indians who are slightly, I wouldn't say slightly, who are far more emotional. And besides, most Indians do not respect rational thinkers like me. They would prefer to see people like me leave the country, especially the armchair nationalists and the left wing communists. I've learned from Jayant that it is better to give up on a country like India that is constantly hurting itself and focus on self improvement. You can't really change the world, you can't change this country, it's a giant mess, but you can change yourself. But it is not enough to merely improve yourself. To live a good life, you need to put yourself in an excellent environment. And if that environment is only available in developed countries that are freedom oriented, then I shall emigrate. The third guest who has had an influence on me is Mr. Tarun Pradhan. I first came across Tarunji's article on a Telegram group. This article was titled Secrets of Making Money. It was one of the most articulate piece of writing that I've come across. This article perfectly married spirituality with pragmatism. I fell in love with this website and continued reading other articles, and I began watching his videos. I had never spoken to Tarunji before getting him on the podcast, but after the podcast, we had 3 calls. Each of this call lasted 1 hour. And during these calls, he took me through his spiritual program that he calls the Path of Knowledge. And he has made me realize some obvious truths about life and existence. And now I consider him as my Guruji. And because of Mr. Tarun Pradhan, today I would say that I'm on a beautiful spiritual journey that will enhance my life. I'm sure of this. So those were the 3 guests who have impacted me the most through this podcast. And if you found these answers satisfactory, do like, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and feel free to leave more of your questions in the comment section. If I'm free, I'll definitely answer those questions. I don't get a lot of time nowadays to come up with new podcast episodes because from the past week I have a full-time job. So I'm not entirely sure what I'll be doing with this channel going forward, but I'll figure it out. Until then, take care of yourself.